Hello again, and welcome to Denton's Tales. Now, a version of this video was originally made for Fringe TV, which is a privately run 24-hour TV channel, and it covers paganism, ecology, spirituality, tarot cards, divination, and many other very varied topics, as well as older mainstream movies with a great deal of interesting content. I give a link to it in the comments below. Now, a question of terminology, which is quite relevant to much of what is on my channel, because a great deal of what I do talk about relates to paganism, be it the Old Norse gods or the Viking Age or whatever. So, from a terminology point of view, I think this video is quite relevant to my channel as a whole. What is a pagan? What does it mean to be a pagan? For that matter, what is a heathen? The two terms are interchangeable. They both mean the same thing, only different, you could say. Very basically, they apply to anyone who doesn't follow the three Abrahamic religions, which are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, at least in their modern usage, though the origins of those terms are often seen as rather degrading by some people who choose not to identify by them as a result. And in themselves, they are actually rather misleading, since their modern usage does not really reflect their original meaning. Neither term had an actual religious connotation until very much later on. But even the concept of paganism itself may be questioned in its historical context when you look at it from a terminology point of view, if you like, seen as being a faith unrelated to the three Abrahamic religions, since that is the definition of pagan, a faith unrelated to the Abrahamic religions. But if you think about it, that can only apply after the creation of those three faiths. So we could ask, were the people before that actually pagans in that sense? Can they, strictly speaking, be called pagans or heathens, since that status depends on the existence of the Abrahamic religions? And if so, what should we call pre-Abrahamic religion? Or should we call it nothing at all? Well, one could get a debate going on that, I'm sure. And to expand a bit on that concept before we proceed further, which I think it's quite interesting. Paganism is a handy term to convey a meaning for a certain type of belief system. It's a good catch-all word, as is heathen. And I always make the point that paganism, in all its many and varied forms, whatever you want to call it, is the world's oldest religion, existing for thousands of years before Abraham came along. Every country in the world having been pagan at one time. It was the religion of our cave-dwelling distant ancestors, though not a formalized religion, of course, back then, but the original universal faith, you could say. But the question can be asked, was it paganism as such by definition in its own time? If you define paganism as an all-embracing, unrelated something that existed prior to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, then yes. But if you define it as something that specifically relates to the existence of those three faiths, in that it isn't any one of them, and that is the dictionary definition, since they didn't exist prior to their existence, if you see what I mean, but what we call paganism did. Yeah. So in that context, in that context, we could say that paganism did not exist at all until Abraham came along. And we can only really define it fully as an existing entity by the 2nd century AD, when it had to compete with Christianity. And then a few centuries later, when Islam was added to the mix. Before that, it had simply been various unrelated religious ideas and practices with no common denominator, either in form or terminology. Now, It could be argued, of course, that all the great early religions of the world were pagan by our standards: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Sumeria, and so on. But when those faiths developed, they were not pagan, strictly speaking, since they had no Abrahamic faith to compete against to make them pagan as far as the dictionary would be concerned. In our modern concept, any religion that is not Christian, Jewish, or Islamic is pagan by definition. Buddhism, Hinduism, Shinto, Wiccan, and any other religious belief you can think of. And they can be both pantheistic with multiple deities or monotheistic with a single deity. And see, a faith does not have to have multiple gods in order to be seen as pagan, as some people seem to think. I mean, I do know people who assume that to be a pagan you must worship all kinds of gods from all over the place, And on that point, I always laugh when I hear pagans described as godless. A very common thing in times past. Those dreadful, godless heathens. Oh, considering the fact that many of them had numerous gods, dozens of them sometimes, like the Old Norse or the Greeks, while the Christians had, just one. Yeah. Having said all that, any debate on was paganism pagan pre-Abrahamic faith is so esoteric and ultimately totally pointless that there's really no point in it, despite my having just made a very big point of it. Oh well. I mean, we have to call it something, so paganism is better than saying, that universal thing that existed before anything else existed. Yeah, that one. Now that would be a bit awkward. The word pagan derives from the Latin paganus, which meant something like rustic, rural, something from the countryside, and later came to be used for non-military people, in other words, civilians. See, in the Roman Empire of the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christian communities existed mainly in the towns, while those following the old gods resided mainly in the rural areas. So a term that originally simply meant someone from the country, a rustic, a villager, with the suggestion of not perhaps being overly intelligent. The townspeople kind of looked down on the country people. What later might be termed a yokel, a country bumpkin, or a redneck, became associated with religion relative to the Christian population, being seen in that context as the religion of the peasants, and also referred to as gentile or Hellene. In the jargon of the Roman army, it came to mean a civilian, a non-combatant, or indeed an unskilled soldier. Now, the main criteria for being considered a pagan, however, was not simply living in the countryside. You didn't have to go out and dwell in a little grass-roofed hut somewhere in the country to be considered a pagan. No, the thing that really defined pagan Christian was the practice of ritual sacrifice, which was the principal difference between the worship of the new god from Palestine and the old Roman and Greek pantheon. So if you just said prayers and burned some incense, you were a Christian. If you pulled the livers and entrails out of sheep and goats and offered them to the gods or consulted them for advice on what was going to happen to next week, then you were pagan. But as I said, to begin with, the term had no religious significance, being a form of locality, not belief, only becoming a rather derogatory religious term later on. Now, however, that was associated with the Latin Roman Church, so it was found in the West. But in the East, words like ethnikos or Gentile were the common words for pagan, with the old Latin paganus used in its original secular meaning, but still, of course, implying those persons to be of a somewhat inferior status, looked down on, In the Middle Ages, paganism was seen as any non-Christian belief, with words like infidel, heretic, blasphemer, and non-believer being added to the anti-pagan rhetoric. Now, while pagan is Latin in origin, heathen comes from Old English and from Germanic roots, themselves perhaps deriving from the Greek ethnos and the Armenian variant heathenos, becoming the Old English hithen, the Norse Hittin, and the High German Heidan, and signifying uncivilized or uncultured persons. Modern neo-pagans seem quite fond of the term, but perhaps not always particularly well versed in the actual meaning of it, very much like those, of course, who call themselves Vikings. Oh, yes. I'm a Viking. I live the Viking lifestyle. Which they are not, and they don't. Nor could they without a ship in which to go off somewhere, raiding, burning, trading, founding settlements in other people's countries, and so on, all of which is, well, rather frowned on nowadays. So, having defined what pagans are in a terminology sense, what do they believe in? What are they from a worship point of view? Well, there is no easy answer to that one. Nothing as straightforward as defining the Abrahamic religions, all three of which, in simple terms, believe in one God, who is the same God, be he called Jehovah, Allah, or just God with a capital G. And their observations and ceremonies are formalized along very strictly prescribed lines. While some pagan rituals are formalized, Hindu, Buddhist, and Shinto, for example, and the ancient religions of Egypt, Babylon, and the like were, of course, formalized, while the Old Norse and the Germanic faiths were the opposite. They were not. Nor are most modern ones. They don't have formalized rituals and prayers written down and repeated exactly the same time after time from prayer books known as missals, as does Roman Catholicism, for example. And defining general paganism, well, it's much like asking, how long is a piece of string? Yes, there are prayers made up, and you'll find them in books, plenty of them, but those are the work of individuals. Prayers and little ceremonies they have made up and shared. They are not the official prayers, not a rigid dogma of any particular faith, like the Hail Mary or the Our Father, the Creed, or other official church prayers that must be recited word for word, exactly, by order of the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Grand Mufti, or some other religious leader. Now, there are hundreds of varieties of pagans: Celtic, Druidic, Wiccans, African, Slavic, Hellenic, Asiatic, Old Norse, and so on ad infinitum. Though some, even though they are still followed today, are really impossible to practice from a historic point of view. In particular, I would be talking about the Old Norse and the Druidic, for example, since there are no written records from those times telling us exactly what their ceremonies and practices were. So following them is largely a matter of guesswork and comparison with still existing similar beliefs, which may or may not be what was actually done centuries ago. Just because they may be pagan and they may have an air of old about them does not mean that they have not changed from those times. Those who may say they follow the Old Norse gods, for example, the gods of Osgard, Odin, Thor, Freya, Frigg, and so on, while they may honor those gods and give them offerings of various kinds, have altars to them, that is quite modern in any ceremonial form, since we have no idea what the Old Norse ceremonies actually were. What words did they say? What tunes may they have sung to honor the gods? What incantations did they use? We have absolutely no idea. Now, we know they made sacrifices, called a blot, which could have involved sacrificing animals, such as goats, sheep, or horses, or human sacrifice in some cases, or just food and drink offered up. But we can't do it today. Now, yes, we can offer food, drink, flowers, crystals, and so on in our modern blots. Animal rights groups, of course, they do rather frown on pulling the guts out of slaughtered goats, and the police would almost certainly take a very dim view of human sacrifices. But we can't do a blot exactly as the Old Norse did, even those involving only offerings of food and meat, because we have no idea of what they said as they did it, what words were used, what prayers were recited, what songs were sung. And without that, the act of the offering in itself does not make it Old Norse. It's an offering, but it's not an Old Norse offering. We know that so-called magic songs were sung, which is lovely, but we can't sing them, as we don't have the words or indeed the tunes. Now, yes, we can make up songs, that is done, but that is not the Old Norse worship. It's a modern version of it, which may be similar to, or it may be completely unlike what they did over 1,000 years ago. And using things from shamanic rituals that still survive today in some countries is really pointless from the view of recreating ancient Scandinavian rituals, since they could be quite unlike Norse practices. Now, there are modern druids. Yes, there are modern druids dressed in robes, even with sacred groves recreated. And that is very nice and an excellent link, I think, with the past. No, human sacrifices, obviously, again, that's frowned on these days. But they have not the slightest idea what the ancient Celtic druids of Britain, Ireland, or Gaul actually did in specific terms. Yeah, they dressed in robes. We know they had like a little sickle for cutting things. We know they were very fond of plants with berries on them and so forth. But in specific terms, we know very little. And Roman accounts by the likes of Tacitus or Julius Caesar mention certain things being done in very broad terms, as do the ancient annals of Ireland, but not how to do them, not the words that were spoken, incantations that were used. Neither the Old Norse nor the Celtic Druids ever wrote anything down. Everything was verbal. So later on, when the last people who knew what was done died, the information died with them. Now, yes, you can follow the Old Norse gods, you can honor them, you can make altars to them, and you can make sacred groves like the Druids. That's wonderful. And make it as close to what they did as modern research and archaeology can discover. But you can never do it exactly as they did, because we just don't know what they did other than in the very, very broadest of ways. We could recreate a Christian mass from, say, the 13th century because we have written texts, even musical notation in some cases. We have illustrations showing the vestments that were worn and so on. But without that, we would be quite unable to do it. My favorite analogy would be that if all you know about Shakespeare's Hamlet is Hamlet's father was murdered by his uncle, he's really annoyed about that. He has a conversation with a skull. His girlfriend dies, and at the end, pretty much everybody else dies, and that's it. That's all you know. You can't perform the play as Shakespeare wrote it. Now, you could write a new play that follows the basic theme, but then it's not Shakespeare's Hamlet. It's yours. It's a shame the Norse never wrote books, which of course they could have done quite easily using the Futhark system of runes, but instead they only use writing in the form of talismans as decorations or the so-called rune stones with inscriptions on them like Håkon was here or Eric went somewhere and died there and the like, which isn't really any use to us. Why they never thought to write things down is a bit hard to say. Other cultures always had. After writing was developed over 5,000 years ago, the Babylonians, Egyptians, Sumerians, Assyrians, and so forth wrote down a great deal, and we have quite a bit of knowledge of their religious practices, but not the Norse. And of course, those ancient pagan religions have almost totally died out. We don't see modern forms of the great religions of the Middle East, such as Babylon, Assyria, or Sumer, nor those of Central and South America, which, of course, is probably rather a good thing. I mean, ripping people's hearts out and chucking them down the steps of pyramids, yeah, it wouldn't really win you any brownie points today. Though some very old and quite peaceful pagan religions are still practiced down to this day. The oldest formal religion in the world is considered to be Hinduism, which began around 7000 BC, as far as we know, though its earliest text, the Rig Veda, dates from around 3,500 years ago, and it is followed by some 900 million people today. Buddhism, followed by some 500 million today, dates from circa 600 BC, founded by Prince Siddhartha Gautama. Buddha was not actually his name. It's just a Sanskrit title meaning the awakened one or the enlightened one, but of course many people think his name was actually Buddha. Founded around the same time as Buddhism, and very similar to it, is Jainism, which has no written texts at all and some 4 million followers today. Shinto, also with roughly 4 million followers, can be traced back to around 700 BC, though in its later form it only came about officially when Buddhism was introduced into Japan around the 6th century. Zoroastrianism dates back to circa 1500 BC, with some 200,000 modern followers. Confucianism, now Confucianism, it isn't a religion as such. It's more of a way of life, a philosophy of how to live, if you like, dating to circa 600 BC and founded by Kung Fu Tzu better known as Confucius. I remember when I was young, all those jokes that you would hear, and they started with Confucius, him say. Of course, none of which he actually ever said. Where that came from, I really have no idea. Some 6 million still follow his teachings. Lastly, we have Taoism, with some 20 million followers today, founded circa 500 BC by Lao Tzu in his book entitled Tao Te Ching. So, when you add them up, that's a total of some 1,434,200,000 followers of ancient pagan religions. That's a lot of pagans. And that's not counting the Old Norse, the Druid, the Wiccan, and all the myriad of others, both old and modern. And pagan beliefs are actually growing in quite a number of countries. But as to the general question of what do pagans believe, there are some ideas that are common to most forms of paganism in one way or another, such as a very deep respect for what we may call Mother Nature. Many pagans seeing their idea of God being nature itself, worshipping Mother Earth and Father Sky, for example, honoring the force of nature, sometimes represented by spirits of the land or the air, such as the Huldafolk or the Landvatir in Iceland. Or the gods can be themselves manifestations of nature. Some pagans may be following polytheism, worshipping numerous gods and goddesses, or they can be monotheistic, having only one deity, or pantheistic, which uses the universe itself as God and God as the universe. But a common trait of paganism is the freedom of choice. Pagans believe that everyone has a right to their own beliefs, regardless of what those beliefs may actually be. There is no real dogma in most modern paganism, no rule book of strict observances to a set of rigid forms and ceremonies which are right and all the others are wrong. However you want to worship, whatever you want to see as God or nature or anything else, as a pagan you have the right to do without the threat of any sanctions. You are free to believe what you want in any way that you want to believe it. Make a church, join a coven, stay at home and worship in your bedroom, make a sacred grove, or visit ancient sacred wells, such as done here in Ireland. Have a little grotto at the end of your garden. Anything you want to do is perfectly fine. One huge difference over the centuries between paganism and the Abrahamic faith, of course, has been tolerance. Though there were instances of pagans fighting amongst themselves or fighting with other pagans or fighting with Christians, obviously that is always going to happen. But overall, they left other people alone. For example, they never sent missionaries to other lands trying to convert people to their way of thinking, for two very simple reasons. One, they didn't have missionaries. And two, they didn't care what somebody else believed. There was never a pagan version of the Inquisition, nor the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Night. And Christian missionaries were not treated badly, as a rule, as in Scandinavia, for example, where the Norse either were quite polite but uninterested, or just ignored the missionaries altogether. And in a couple of cases, the Christian missionaries were told, you want to build a church? Oh, build a church. We don't really care, but go ahead if you feel like it. That would not have been the same, unfortunately, had pagans sent missionaries to Christian countries in the Middle Ages, for example. They would undoubtedly have been invited to a lovely barbecue in the town square. The downside would have been that they would have been the barbecue. What do you have to do to be pagan? People ask. Well, that brings us back to how long is a piece of string. I suppose one could say believe in something spiritual without doing it in a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. There is no right or wrong way to be a pagan. No formalized doctrine or dogmas that is a must, something that you must believe in to be one, unlike, say, Roman Catholicism, where you must believe in the Holy Trinity to be a member of the Church. Belief in the Trinity is a vital part of being a Roman Catholic. Of course, ironically, the Holy Trinity was a pagan concept before the Church adopted it in the 4th century. Now, a lot of pagans say they follow the old ways, as they put it. which means basically anything that existed prior to and has nothing to do with the three Abrahamic faiths. And that can be pretty much anything from anywhere that was done by our ancestors, such as, well, celebrating the changing of the seasons, as was done here in Celtic Ireland, with the four great quarter-day festivals of Imbolc, Beltane, Lunasa, and Samhain. And as a little side note there, Imbolc, as from 2023, will be an officially recognised public holiday in Ireland, bank holiday as it's called here, on the first Monday of February, to be known as Imbolc St. Bridget's Day, since the 1st of February was the date of Imbolc and also the feast day of the great Celtic triple goddess Brigid, later taken by the church, turned into just one person, renamed St. Bridget, and a halo popped on her head. I find it quite interesting that quite a staunchly Catholic country like Ireland should now have an official holiday dedicated to, well, a pagan festival. That's quite an interesting one, I think. Now, magic. Oh, yes, magic. Pagans are often seen by some people as casting spells and, hexing others. Oh, Expelliarmus sort of thing, while dancing naked in sacred groves, pulling the guts out of goats at midnight under the blasted oak, or wearing pointy hats, while sitting around bubbling cauldrons as they drop eye of newt and toe of frog into it, stirring it to create magic potions. Anyway, while that view may be just a tad exaggerated, forms of magic do form a part of some pagan practices, right enough, though nothing so Shakespearean, no pointy hats. Those systems that derive from shamanism as well as witchcraft and Wicca, for example, having casting circles for spells, using charms and talismans, making potions of various kinds, using runes for protection or binding, tapping into the powers of crystal and so forth. Now, nothing like Gandalf or Merlin, however. A talisman or amulet, for example, is something that enables your thoughts to be directed to higher powers. It may bring you comfort or well-being, but you can't hold back a zombie apocalypse with it, nor is it one ring to control them all. And, well, good examples, I suppose, of talismans or amulets, whichever term you want to use, would be the hammer of Thor, Mjolnir. That would probably be one of the most famous ones from Old Norse times. Or this is a little amulet of the Norse goddess Freyja. It dates from the 8th or 9th century AD, and the original is in the National Museum of Sweden. Or you can have something like this, which is just a piece of deer antler polished. And that would be quite a typical talisman. Now, natural medicine, that also has a place among many pagans, which is understandable, of course, given the general pagan concern for nature, for the earth itself and all that springs from it, the understanding of the use of plants and other natural medicinal substances, such as some forms of antibacterial mud, herbal remedies, and the like, which do work. White sage has been scientifically proven to reduce microorganisms in the air when it's burned, for example. Of course, when people say to me, how can plants have medicinal powers? That's just an old wives' tale. It belongs in fairy stories. I say to them, if a plant can kill you, why shouldn't another plant be able to kill you? But if you think plants have no effect on the human body, then swig down a nice cold glass of hemlock and see how you get on. It didn't do very much for Socrates, but then maybe you'll be lucky. You'll just wish you were dead. Now, something that is often misconstrued about pagans, their morals, or, well, lack of them, according to some. Many people see pagans as evil or at least undesirable, equating pagan with godless and thus sinful. Godless. That is rather amusing, as I said, given the fact that pagans often have numerous gods, dozens of them in some faiths, such as Hinduism, while Christians have only one. So, if numbers of gods determine one's moral status, pagans are way ahead. Now, Pagans don't have the Christian concept of sin as such, but they do have very strong moral codes. They believe in doing the right thing in goodness for its own sake, not because some divine being told them to do so or some religious leader told them to do it. They just do it because they feel they want to do it. Now, to me, a person who does good simply because it's the right thing to do, they do it because they want to do it. That is a good thing to do. That is why they do it. Is far superior to one who does it to get a front seat in heaven. Done not for the sake of being good, not caring about that, but simply letting God know they're doing it. Hello, I say, God, you got a minute? You see this rather disgusting, down and out homeless person here who smells awful, and I'm certainly not bringing him into my house, but look, I'm giving him some coins because I want you to see how good I am. You remember that? No, I can't quite get my mind around that one. Another difference between pagans and Christians is life after death. The idea of heaven as a lovely place of fluffy clouds where people go around with halos over their heads twanging harps, that is completely foreign to pagans, as is the concept of hell, where those of a less than nice persona will burn in fire while being poked with tridents by laughing demons. Burn, baby, burn. Ha ha. Yes. But what do pagans believe in? Well, there's no easy answer to that one, because there is no hard and fast pagan belief regarding that. Some believe in reincarnation, where a soul returns in another body, doing so maybe many times as it evolves until it eventually learns all the possible life lessons. Others thinking a soul could return in the form of animals and work its way up. Others see it as just a transfer of life energy, since of course energy cannot be destroyed, and thus alters form, and they live on in an altered state. Some see it as a form of heaven, perhaps like the Summerland of the Wiccans, but most see it as totally unlike the Christian idea, even if they do regard it as a place, such as the Celtic Otherworld, or Tir na Nog, or Magmel, the Old Norse Valhall, where one may dwell with Odin or with Freya in Folkvanger, or in Hell, spelt with one L in the Norse sense, and ruled by the goddess of the same name, and a realm really much the same as life before death. People drink, eat, have sex, fight, etc. There are others who think we may have options when we die, choosing to join the gods, to reincarnate, or become perhaps a spiritual guide. Sadly, there is no way to know with any certainty, and you will only get the answer after you're dead, which is a bit late. Of course, perhaps all beliefs are correct, but whatever you believe is what you will experience, or none of them are correct, and the afterlife will be nothing like anything that we have surmised. As I said, you'll have to wait till you get there to find out. All of this shows how varied pagan beliefs actually are. What one could say that it might appear to outside observers that no two pagans think exactly the same way, given all the varying aspects of beliefs and practices, from some old structured beliefs like Hinduism to anything anybody feels like believing in today, worshipping a turnip on a stick if you feel like it. Not one of which can be said to truly represent paganism, being so varied and multi-layered that it cannot be represented by any one individual practice, or even a group of them. Take up 100 varieties of paganism. Well, even that doesn't encompass the whole thing. It is quite a massive subject. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. That helps the YouTube algorithms. And until the next time, I shall say goodbye for now. And of course, watch this space. That's very important. Bye for now.